Hey there, I'm Christine Zernheld.
AKA Shep.
And it is officially Marketing O Talk. On these special episodes, we take a break from just reading the news and take a deeper look at a specific digital marketing topic. And today is our first non-advertising marketing talk. So I'm joined by some highly esteemed SEO experts. Just like our famous Friday news shows, you'll be able to catch this episode on YouTube if you want to see the smiling faces of our special guests. And those guests are, first, someone you may know, partner and digital marketer at Cypress North and Marketing O'Clock co-host Greg Finn. Hi, Greg.
Hey, thanks for having me, Shep. It's great to be here on Marketing O'Clock.
Yeah, I didn't really give you a choice, but thanks for coming.
Appreciate it.
We are also joined by SEO consultant at G Squared Interactive, Marketing O'Clock's BFF of the show 2019. Glenn Gabe is finally on the blower. Hi, Glenn.
Hi, it's awesome to be here. I have my award literally behind me, if you can actually say it. I'm not kidding. But It's great to be here to talk about web stories.
Awesome. We're so excited to have you. And finally, please welcome digital solutions expert and founder creator of SERP Scraper tool through Samuel Schmitt. Hi, Sam. How are you?
Hi, everyone. And bonjour from France.
We're so happy to have you here.
I like this is our first international marketing talk. I love it. I guess Andrea, she brought the Venezuela.
She recorded in the States.
Yeah. Okay.
So I will be moderating our discussion today about web stories. I'm looking forward to hearing everyone's experiences with web stories because these have been around for a little bit and Greg tries to push them so hard on the show every week, but I feel like nobody's talking about them. So we're going to change that today. So let's get right into it. Sam, I want to start with you. So everyone's on the same page here. Can you tell our listeners what web stories are and how they're different from stories on social media?
Right. So as you mentioned, so we all know stories from Facebook, Instagram, right? And basically they look the same. So it's a series of pages, slides with images, text, and video. So this is what we call the stories. But they are a bit different. First are for the web. So for the open web, meaning that you can share them. You don't need an application to watch them. You don't have to be inside a social network. Also, we can say maybe that they're created by Google, even if it's not really true. But I mean, Google is behind this format. And so, yes. So basically, the main difference is that you could find them on Google search. You don't need an application to watch them. And also you have more control over the edition flow. I think we will go into detail later. And one last difference is that there is no limit in the lifespan. So you all know that stories on Facebook is usually 24 hours, I think, something like this, right? And so here, I mean, it's like any web page. As long as it's online in your website, then you can still read the web story. Does it make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense to me. But let's show our listeners some examples of these for anyone who hasn't seen them. So I gave you all a little bit of homework to bring some great examples of web stories. So let's start with you, Glenn. Have you seen any great examples out there?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not just like one or two that I think are great. It's across different types, just to show that it can be across different types of sites, different types of publishers. There was a great one about how to make money. Basically, great use of video, great use of just like a how-to of how something happens, page by page showing it. And also we'll be covering ads later on, but they also use ads there as well. So they're monetizing that as well. I thought that was a really good use. Another great use is sports leagues are really using them. So they've partnered up with Google. Major League Baseball, I'm a big MLB and NFL fan. MLB was actually using stories like as games were going on. So it's not just a recap. It's literally, I would be in the third inning and I would go Yankees score and I'd see the little stories icon in the search results go and it was up to that inning. It was being updated in real time. So it's really cool to be able to track that. And they were using advertising as well. So just checking before, I think there were over 11 or 1,200 of those MLB stories that they've run already. So they really were testing it heavily. Then there were some, like for example, a recipe. That's another great use of web stories, right? Where you could actually take people through specific steps and using video as well. I thought that was a great use. And then I'm just going to plug my own because I've been delving into web stories, but I've created a few that cover more about what what's going on with Google and SEO, but one in particular, which was the page experience update in Signal, basically speculating about how powerful those sub signals will be. I used a lot of motion graphics to kind of like punch certain points. So the visuals and animation, I thought worked really well, and I got a lot of good feedback on it as well. And that actually ranked really well in Discover, ranks well right now in search, and in image search as well. So those are good examples. I think I provided a few more, but those are ones that are out of my head.
One that I really liked, Glenn, that you had shared was that comparison. I believe it was about that Surface laptop.
Yes.
And it really broke it down very nicely, where you could see like the specific hardware and like the back cover. And I thought that that was a great example because, again, it really has that kind of like bite-sized nature to it.
I thought that's a great use, right? And there are so many publishers publishing a lot of web stories right now because they've realized, and we're going to cover some of the ranking aspects and metrics later, but that you can really get a lot of eyeballs on it. So they're using it across different things, but product comparisons, amazing. And when we talk about the future of web stories, I have some ideas, and I have no idea from Google if this is going to happen, but there are some e-commerce related things that can go on with products that I think would be really, really powerful. And I could see them doing something like that.
Yeah. And I really like the example you put into with the horror movies.
Yeah.
It was like a spooky season example.
Right.
And because depending on how you build them, you can kind of see a preview of the next slide, and they had images that like carried over.
Right.
I thought that was a cool creative decision.
And
so,
that's a great point about visuals, which we're going to be coming to at some point soon in this podcast, where we're going to talk about the power of images and how to edit and everything. But someone was really smart and creative behind the scenes with how they did that one. So I thought that was cool. And the crazy part is that one isn't like super engaging, but it's really cool. And people are looking for that around Halloween. What are the top horror movies? I mean, I'm a huge horror movie fan, but I thought that one worked really well.
Definitely. Thanks. Sam, you brought us an example too, right?
Yes, exactly. So from L'Oréal, you might know the French company. And so it's an interesting approach because it's not, so they use basically a web story in their store. So you go to their store or you go to a supermarket, you have a L'Oréal product, and you can basically, you have a QR code, so you can just display the web story on your phone, on your mobile. And then instead of having a boring landing page, you have a nice web story and where you can have more information about the product. So I think it's really a good approach because it brings stories into the physical store. And as well, I think we'll come back later to the analytics part, but you can really see how people engage with your product and how fast they go in the story. So it gives you additional insight, I think, for marketers. So yeah, great use case.
That's a really neat idea to use it as point of sale. Cool.
Yes, exactly.
And Greg, did you bring us any examples?
I did, but I wanted to say first, Sam, you sound so much more educated than I do in general. I'd be like, that L'Oreal. Hey, Colby, do you need any more L'Oreal products? So I didn't know that was the proper way to pronounce it. And there we go. We learn something every day. So at least you got
Colby's
that.
Greg's wife, by the way.
So I personally like the ones that really have images. And I thought the Halloween one was great. I like the comparison. I hadn't really thought of that. The ones that I generally see, and one that stood out to me is it was from Forbes, and it was just to look at all the different drone awards and some of the best shots from drone. And it was like a very nice subtle pan. You'll be able to see all the examples over on marketingoclock.com or in the show notes on YouTube, Facebook, wherever you're watching this. And it's going to be up on screen right now. But you already covered a bunch of things that worked really good. So I've got a couple examples that I thought were really poor examples. So first off, I saw Vice has started using web stories to try to make articles come to life. And at first I was like, well, they're using this and maybe it's good. And I looked, and do you ever see on like the Instagram stories when you hop in there and you just see at the top, it looks like somebody like fell asleep on the period button, and it's just like dot, 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 dot. There's so much content up there. Well, that's what Vice has been doing. And there's an example in the link where it talks about somebody sent a lookalike to high school and has 43 different pages within
out
the
of control
story. And
I mean, it's like nobody cares about that story anyway.
I'm with you on that.
Of all the stories to make 40 slides.
It reminds me, because I do a lot of work with companies that have been impacted by algorithm updates, right? And in the past, you don't see this as much, thankfully. Sites that would break up an article into 84 paginated pages just to monetize the heck out of it, right? Like, don't do that. And it doesn't work for web stories either, because I agree. And you could actually get past the point of where a new round of pages shows up in a web story, which is probably what you saw with that. It's just not cool to do that.
100%. And then another one that I thought was an example that looked really cool. Somebody put a lot of work into it, and it was Back to the Future Recipes Cookbook from Inverse. And the only issue is the recipes are in horizontal format, which you'll see on the screen right now. And you can't zoom in with a web story right now. So it is basically useless. And then they also forgot to link out. That's one of the big powerful portions of this that we'll talk about, is if you can get audience, like market share and audience attention, but you also still want them to complete what your goals are. And for this, they had some really funny recipes related to Back to the Future, but you couldn't get there. You couldn't zoom in. And it was a very frustrating experience if you were actually on mobile. So you can see a couple of those examples of what not to do with some of the web stories.
Absolutely.
Great.
Greg, I had that show up for me later after I saw you had posted it in my Discover feed, by the way.
Nice.
So it was there, and I actually totally agree. And Paul Backhouse from Google, who's kind of driving the whole web stories thing, would say the same thing, right? I'm sure he would be like, don't do that. Create visuals that everybody can see and engage with. Don't make somebody like try and like squeeze something in and try and figure out what's there.
Great. So hopefully our listeners have a better understanding of what these actually are now. So I want to talk about where these can be found online. So the first place that people can find these is in Google search. How do web stories show in the search engine results pages, Sam? Will searchers be able to identify these as different from normal web pages?
Yes, So as you said, where to find them? On Google, right? So you can find them on Google desktop version. And then when there is a web story, you will see like this thumbnail, like sometimes you see like this little image, and you have a kind of icon so you can identify that it's web stories. But to be fair, nobody cares that it's a web story. If the title is engaging, he will click on it and then he will see the web story on his desktop. Of course, web stories are designed or made for mobile. So you can hopefully, fortunately, you will find them when you browse Google from your mobile. I just want to highlight a few things here because right now, when you search for a web story on desktop, from everywhere in the world, you could find a web story. Mobile is still limited to US and to English only. So me, as a poor French, I cannot really see all the great web story created by you guys in the US. So yes, this is a bit of pity at the moment and a limitation, I think. I hope Google will solve that very soon. But on mobile, there is a nicer way to display them, a kind of grid view where you can see all the stories in a top stories section. And yes, and also, I guess we'll tackle the Google Discover, right, very soon. I think Greg is more advanced. So it's also there where you could find them.
Yeah, and I think Sam, that's a great point. And one of the things that we kind of on our show, Marketing O'Clock, our weekly show, where I kind of cover the SEO side of things, there's sort of a flair that I think more folks that would identify as an SEO would be more familiar with, where you see that in the search results pages on mobile is where I see it, is those visual stories. And there's usually like a 4-pack of big, bold stories that can show up on mobile. And, it can show up for things, and on screen right now, you'll see that it's showing up for tourist attractions in New York City. And, we've had clients that do this back when you could go to New York City and tour things. And, that is a big deal to be able to get included in something like that and basically kind of take that, the ability to hop up to the first page, even though it is through stories. So I think that there's many different layers to it, but from a kind of pure search or SEO standpoint, it does show in mobile in the SERPs. And then the kind of the big bold thing that also shows up that's a little bit different are those visual stories.
The other thing I just wanted to say is that they also show up in Google Images. A lot of people don't realize that. And what's cool is you just don't see the stories icon. The stories icon animates. So it definitely attracts your eye for sure. I know some of mine are actually ranking there and it's really cool. And then in Google Images, we'll actually start playing, we'll swipe up and start playing the story right away. Kind of like swipe up for AMP, which they have. And the other thing is, because people ask me about this, they can actually rank on desktop and mobile as featured snippets. So my stories have actually ranked as featured snippets. So especially on desktop, which is pretty cool. And a lot of people don't realize, I mean, it's just, they're not even going to know it's a story because it's not, there's no like visual there in the desktop results, but they can rank in featured snippets, Google Images, Discover, and Search. The one area I haven't seen them actually rank is interesting finds, which is a really important search feature, but it's almost like they're not including stories in there for some reason. At least I haven't seen them show up. So
we'll have to look for that. Greg, can you talk a little bit about how these display differently on different devices? Because Sam mentioned earlier they're kind of made for mobile, but you can find them on desktop too, right?
Yeah, and I think Glenn kind of covered a little bit of that. The one thing of note that I don't necessarily like about some of the way that they're displayed is it's really hard sometimes to know what's a story and what's not a story. You know, and in that example, we were covering something that Glenn talked about in the show 2 weeks ago, and it was about what would be a tiebreaker and kind of ranking factors. And I went to go search for it, and I did a quick search on my computer, and I hopped in. I saw it was G Squared Interactive. I popped on over there, and I opened the story up, and that was what was shown above. And you'll see it in the search results pages over at marketingclock.com in the show notes. So it does show up on desktop, and I didn't necessarily know that. There's not a really discernible way unless I saw that stories in the URL there. And then sometimes it appears to me, and Glenn, you can kind of corroborate this or let me know I'm way off here, but sometimes that thumbnail does show up, and I've got an example. So I took that, and then I started searching on mobile, and I saw Glenn's post came up with a little thumbnail, and you see the stories there. So on desktop, not so much. And then doing a search for some of our own stuff, because we do stories for Marketing and Clock that kind of recap everything and then send people over to the site, we didn't have stories. So it'd be nice to kind of have something that's a little bit more uniform when you could actually know what a story is.
I totally agree. I think desktop needs something, right? And it's one of the reasons that I like adding it in the URL, because it does show, at least for mine or sites that are putting it into a story subdirectory or a story subdomain, that you see it's a story. And for people that realize that, that's cool. On mobile, it's great. You have the portrait image there with the icon for stories. That's great. On Google Images, same way. Google Discover, you can figure out it's a story. But desktop, that's probably feedback that they need to maybe do something there that would be cool.
Glenn, have you seen any ranking trends for web stories specifically, or have you uncovered any SEO best practices with these?
Yeah, sure. So first, I'll just talk about web stories ranking in general. So like we've covered before, it's just like any other web page. Paul Backhouse just actually did an SEO video about web stories, which is really cool. And I'll cover some of the things that he covered. But they could rank just like any other page. So the one thing I did notice early on, which really is what kind of got me into web stories, I'm a big Discover fan, use it a lot. And I started seeing stories show up. And I'm like, okay, Google, I think, is pushing stories here. So that's when I tested my own. And I had that first story had over 530,000 impressions. From, my blog, which is a one guy blogging about stuff. So I was like, all right, they're definitely doing something funny here, which was cool. And you could see that, and I'll give some stats and stuff like that. But from an SEO perspective, there are several things that I would definitely cover. And again, Paul kind of covered these. One is a requirement, which is the metadata that you need, right? So it's actually, it's not necessarily a ranking thing. It's more of an eligibility thing. So it's actually really important. So the four pieces that you need are, the publisher, you need to include that in the metadata in the story, the publisher logo, which should be square. And there's all the specs are actually on the web story documentation. Then you need a portrait poster. So that's the image that can show up in Google Discover. It could actually show up in the search results on mobile. And then a title, which they recommend under 40 something characters. That's really tight. You don't have to do that, but it will get cut off if it's not less than that. And that's not your title tag, which I'll get to in a minute. So that metadata is really important. One thing people don't understand, because it hasn't been broadcast very well, is the AMP test for Google in Google Search Console is actually also the web story test, right? So if you actually search Google web story test, it'll actually prompt you at the top of the results, search results, to actually test your web story, just like it does for AMP. And when you do that, it will tell you if it's valid. It could actually show you how it will show up as well. It shows you the display. So that you definitely want to do and make sure it's valid. And then beyond that, think of it just like any other SEO task, right? Good title tag, strong title tag, using what people would search for, right? So nice and descriptive. include a good solid meta description. Definitely use open graph tags and Twitter cards, right? Because that's what can show up when people share it on social media. Clean URLs. So you could use hyphens as word separators. You don't have to include stories in the URL. I like to do that, like what we spoke about before. And then links. I think maybe Greg had brought this up before, but use links inside your web stories to link out, right? Because to Google, that's a standard link, right? So that could help your other content, plus get people to your site. And then from your site, link to your web story, right? Passing signals and page rank from an SEO standpoint. So very important to do that, or else it can, web story could easily become like a black hole that people are in. Just a few more pieces. So with images, you use alt attributes or alt text. And for video, you can use captions or subtitles. So there's documentation on that in the web story guidelines. And then the biggest thing, which Paul emphasized, and I totally agree with, content is king. Great content, high quality, relevant content is still more important than anything else that I just covered, other than the requirements to show up. So those are kind of the things that I've seen and that has been communicated by Google.
And I did have one follow-up SEO question for you, because I just listened to the Search Off the Record podcast about web stories, and Pascal talked about how Google sees these as one page. So is there anything our listeners should do differently from an optimization standpoint based on that information that they see it as one page?
That's a great question. And there is actually. So it is one page. Again, it's one page to Google. So all of that content is going to count towards that one web story or one page.
So Greg, I know that you are an avid Google Discoverer. We talk about it all the time. Can you explain how web stories work in Google Discover and how their presence in Discover is different from other articles?
Yeah, so I think, that's one of the reasons why, well, listening to Glenn and reporting on the show all the time is one of the main reasons. But number two, I love web stories. It kind of goes back to me like those old social aggregation days where it's sort of like really customized and tailored to what you're looking for. Like a stumble upon, let's say, where you're just finding really cool new stuff. And to me, when you're using Google Discover, you do see that these stories are bigger and bolder many times than what you typically find in Discover. And so you'll see, and there's an example on the screen where it talks about, I think it's like tips for a cozy Zoom Thanksgiving, which sounds terrible to me, but I mean, maybe you want to check that out. And there's like a little story icon that shows up there. And then I'd say it's roughly, 1.5x the size of a normal Discover article on there. And then you hop right off. People know that it's going to be something easy to consume, and you're kind of on your way. And for those Discover stories that are AMP, it's in the same spot as that in the upper right-hand corner. So sometimes you can see a gallery of those stories here. So what I've seen, and Glenn, you can, or Sam, you can let me know too, but if it's kind of grouped and sort of in the same category, like I've seen it for recipes, you can then kind of swipe horizontally to go through different stories. And again, it is a much bigger, much bolder, more prominent looking space on Google Discover.
Absolutely. I mean, the carousel was launched recently in Google Discover, the stories carousel, which they say ranks at the top. It doesn't always rank at the top. I actually clarified this with Google. It's near the top, but still very prominent. And they're really pushing stories hard. And by the way, just talking about Discover, I just want to give you some stats. I won't explain who the clients are, but there are 2 large scale publishers that I'm helping that do a lot of web stories. So one over the past, I think it was past 8 weeks or so, they had 1.4 million clicks and 87 million impressions from web stories just in Discover. And the other had over 520,000 clicks and 30 million impressions just from web stories in Discover. It's no joke. If you are a publisher, and we'll cover this later, ignore at your own peril at this point, because your competitors are probably doing it and gaining the benefits.
And Glenn, I did want to segue off into tracking with these real quick.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about tracking with web stories? Can you see traffic in Google Analytics or Search Console?
Absolutely. And I know Sam originally had posted in one of his articles about the basic tracking, which was cool because it was a confusing thing. A lot of people that were getting into web stories either left out tracking or the WordPress plugin didn't have it originally. And then, no one could see what's going on. So there are 2 different aspects, right? One is my recommendation would be to get basic tracking up and running first, right? So it's going to basically register in Google Analytics just like any other page on your website, which is fine, but you'll quickly want to know what's going on inside your web story, because again, it's a series of pages, right? It's like someone going through an immersive experience on your site. So just seeing how many people visit that page is not really cool. So that's when I dug deeper with the documentation, because there wasn't really great documentation on how to track what's going on within web stories. It ends up, there's lots of functionality there that's pretty easy to implement that would enable you to track a number of things. So I wrote a blog post recently about how to exit the black hole of web story tracking, where you could actually track story progress, right? So you could actually see how far someone's getting in. You could actually label those pages however you want as well, which is really cool. Like I'll do page number and then the title from the ID of that specific page. So you could see where the drop off is. Is everybody dropping off at page 4 for some reason? Why is that? Maybe there's a glitch there. Maybe there's a problem. Maybe the content isn't engaging, whatever it may be. You could also track how many people get to the end of your web story, and then how many people get to the book end, right? And again, there's lots of other stuff that you can do, but these are some basic things that really open up what's going on inside your web story. And what's cool, and it's funny, so I posted this, so I hand code my web stories. I just have, because I wanted to really understand how these things work. But the WordPress plugin looks like it's really progressing and doing great. And I had Brody Clark, who I know that you've mentioned on this show. He uses the WordPress plugin, and he was like, hey, Glenn, I just checked after reading your article, and I think the plugin's actually using those events and triggers. So you'll be happy to know, if you're using the WordPress plugin, that a lot of that tracking is being sent automatically to Google Analytics. So it's pretty cool.
Mm-hmm. And then another thing too, which is probably common knowledge, is, you know, with those links that are going off to your site, you could tag those as well, put UTMs on specifically if you wanted to. If you've got all this traffic coming in, you want to see how it actually plays out. That's another just thought there too.
Absolutely. And one thing about tracking, and this isn't even a Google Analytics thing, it's just remember, and I fell prey to this early on, but if you don't link out of your web story, and I think Greg touched on this before, people aren't going to leave your web story.
Right? What's the point?
Right, they'll go through the web story and then hop back to the search results, or they'll be off on their way. So make sure you add a page or two, or your bookend is really strong, that basically gets people to more information on your site, or to your Twitter profile if you want them to follow you, or whatever you want. But just don't leave the story self-contained, or else you're going to see a lot of people coming in and going nowhere.
Awesome. And I want to shift back to you, Sam, to talk about crafting these, because you have so many great articles on your website about this. So do you find storyboarding to be an important part of the creation process with web stories? And how do you develop the concept for your web story content?
Yes, of course. I mean, we already, I think, answered this question during this conversation. But yes, one first point for me is really key. It's like, as we said, you should not put too much slides. I mean, if you have 40 slides or 50 slides, I mean, people will get bored, or they won't finish or go until the end of the story. And as Glenn just said, the idea is that it's a kind of funnel. You have to bring people to your story and to lead them to another step. So maybe your website or your Twitter account or anything else. So build your story also around images, nice text, videos, not too much text, just a nice and bold title. And yes, and also what I can usually see is like people create a story from an article. So try to find really the essence of your article. What is the most important part of this article? Cut it in small pieces. And then the idea could be like a teaser, you know, like you share that on social media, or you are found on Google. And then if people are interested, they will jump into your article and continue reading. I think, Glenn, you did that exactly for your stories. Is it true?
I think that's a phenomenal point. So some people are using companion web stories for their articles, right? So I wrote, I think it was like 3,000 word post on the page experience signal for SEMrush blog. And then after that, created a web story that's a companion that kind of dug deeper. It was much shorter, obviously, and covered more of like the power of the subsignals. And then I linked to that post several times, depending on the page content within the web story. So I think that if you're a publisher and you're writing longer form content, don't think web stories can't help. They can, just if you create a companion that's tighter and more focused, I think it could really work. And also just on the storyboarding piece. So earlier in my career, I used to develop multimedia applications. So this is one of the reasons that I just loved web stories, because it reminded me of my younger self doing this stuff. But the storyboarding process is super, super important. If you just hop in and try and build a web story, you're going to get lost. Or you might end up with, Greg banging his head against his monitor because you have 50 slides or pages there. So map it out. And when you map it out, it's amazing. It's like mapping out a blog post. And I think Sam had said this too, like a skeleton structure. And you start to go, oh, wait, I need this, or I don't need this. And what visuals work here? So you should have almost like when I used to shoot video for multimedia, you would have a shot list, right? So this is almost like, web story list where you would say, I need this background visual, these smaller elements that are going to animate in, maybe a voiceover for this, video for this, so on and so forth. And before you know it, you have a document that you're like, you can go build your web story with just that document. So I would not, I can't emphasize enough how much storyboarding is important.
Yeah, and maybe also just one thing, stay simple. I mean, don't try to overcomplicate your web stories, because it's so easy to try to put too much fluff on it, and just stay simple.
Yeah, if you're trying to get complex, link off your web story.
Right, exactly.
Glenn, have you found any best practices for videos or images with web stories?
Yeah, so, along the same lines of, from the storyboard, you're going to realize that visuals are really, really important. I mean, for web stories, they should be super engaging. Not all are, some are really engaging. I said it in my blog post. I provided a blog post about tips for building web stories after digging in myself. And one subhead was Photoshop is your friend, right? Because I'm not saying everybody needs Photoshop, but you need an editing application where you could actually create really engaging visuals. And what, Paul Backhouse in his video about certain things explained this as well. Don't burn text into the images, meaning when he says that, that's putting the text into the background images, because you don't know the size of everybody's viewport. So you want to use web stories and all the functionality there as much as possible. So create really engaging backgrounds, right? And if you're going to layer text on top of that, cool. Other visuals on top of it, images. So web stories support transparency. So you can create, like in one of my web stories, I had a mobile pop-up drop down, with a nice animation effect, but it was there was a transparent piece showing the background. There's lots of cool stuff that you can do. From a background standpoint for your web story, it should be a 3:4 aspect ratio. So make sure it's portrait, unless you're going to do landscape, which I don't want to muddy the waters here, but you can actually have web stories that are landscape and then look portrait on a mobile phone. It's full bleed. They're really cool, but a lot of people are doing just portrait. So just make sure that they're clean, clear. You don't burn text into images, 3:4 aspect ratio, and get very familiar with editing images. For example, layering in Photoshop, having to select and cut things out in Photoshop to create a really cool effect. The portrait I did for my discuss indexing problem with Google, it's a cool robot kind of leaning into a cool background with Google. And those are multiple images that I used in Photoshop to get them together to create that one. Doing that really, you're never going to find one image for your specific thing that really is perfect. So being able to edit those is really smart. So with video, you definitely want to make sure, because most people are viewing this are going to be seeing it as mobile. So you want to make sure you shoot it that way. So shooting with your phone is actually a great way to do it if you're going to capture anything like that. Yeah, you had a question on there too, I saw, right?
Sure did.
And our time's flying by here, but I did want to ask you guys specifically about the cover of the web story, because I know that's a really important part. So Greg, what do you think makes a good cover? And then anyone can chime in that wants to.
Glenn just covered a bunch of it, no pun intended. But I think, the one thing is this is your chance to get somebody to click when you show up, especially in Discover. So having something big and bold and really showing what your story is about is helpful. So think about it, maybe are you going to entice a click? Glenn covered the fact that it's 3x4. They recommend 640 wide by 853 high. And they also say don't burn in images. And then on the video themselves, Paul has the example of what his covers look like. And there's burned in text on the cover, which is funny. So you can see that. But it's out of the way.
Yeah.
It's out of the way too, because it usually comes in at the bottom of the screen currently. What it might be in a few years, we don't know. But just again, try to make something big, bold, and something that's easy to click through. And then Glenn, I think you had a great point here where it's this is more than you in a way. It's what about your design team? What about your video? This is if you've got a creative team, this goes beyond SEO, it goes beyond content. Use whatever resources you have to make these look good, as it is so visual of a format. So I thought that was a fantastic point that's easily overlooked.
Definitely. And because you don't have much space for text as well. So have a really good copywriter. People that are heavy on Twitter, like I am, it works well because you don't have a lot of space there. But yeah, the visuals are really important, and the flow, right? And I think Paul had a video about the flow as well, because again, it's super important. And a lot of people that haven't built productions like that, they might sit down and go, oh, it's going to be easy. I'm going to build a web story and go, whoa, this doesn't flow well, and it doesn't sound right, and it doesn't look right and everything. But people want engaging web stories, so try and do that as much as possible.
Sam, you have a lot of great content on your site, samuelschmitt.com. Yeah,
Thank
we
you.
will link to it in the show notes, listeners. But you talk a lot about the different tools that people can use to build the web stories. So I really recommend that anyone who's interested in these, check out those articles. But can you give us a quick overview of some of the best story creation tools and features that make creation flow easier?
Yes, I can give you an overview. I cannot tell you which one is the best because, they're all different. And first, they did a great job for the web story community. I think they were really the first really developing the format. And even before Google WordPress blogging, they were here enabling us creating web story easily. So I did an interview of 8 web story builder. There is more than that, but on my website, you can have 8 interview, 8 detailed article about a web story tool. So what I can say is that basically, they share a common set of features. First, you can start from a template. So you select a template, you can drag and drop image, you can drag and drop text, video. So Glenn and myself, we developed with our hands web stories. You can do that, but a lot of people don't code. So these kind of tools are really great. So let's say in 15 minutes, you can create a nice web story and publish it on your website. Also, they are bringing new feature and other features that are really great. You can create quiz and poll directly in the web stories. You can capture email information, and this is really great, I think, because you can even think about the web story for a lead generation tool, because you can send a web story to anybody, and if you like your product, he might, share his email address or something like this, more information about himself. Also, we spoke about analytics, and this tool also have a built-in analytics often, so you can see how people engage with your story. You can see how people engage at the page level. So you don't have to set up Google Analytics and all this stuff. So there is few tools. And as I said, each of them is focused on a different niche, let's say. So if you want to have more detail, just come back to me and I will tell you which one might be the best for your need.
Yeah, you've got all the pros and cons there on your site. So
yes, exactly.
Definitely check it out.
Yes.
Glenn, we've touched on this a little bit, but is there a way that people are monetizing web stories? Can you run ads on them?
You definitely can. I haven't run them for my own purposes, but I have clients that are running them. And there are some examples, like we covered some really positive, really good examples of web stories before that are running ads. But you could actually run So it's AMP Story Auto Ads is what they are. And you actually don't place your ads, from what I understand. It figures out where the ads should go for you. And you need at least 7 pages in your web story to actually qualify for this. So they have really good documentation on this. And I believe Greg took a look at the documentation as well. But you definitely can monetize them. I'd love to actually find out how well that's being monetized, because I know AMP in the past, some publishers have complained that they couldn't monetize as well as they wanted to. I'm wondering if they're seeing the same with web stories or if it's going well, but I'll try and figure that out and find some more information out.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. And when we've had publisher clients as well, and we look at the kind of the performance, let's say, of specific AMP pages versus desktop pages, that's always sort of a complaint because you don't have the full features, similar with web stories, right? So you currently, the ad platforms that support web story ads right now are Google Ad Manager, anything that's direct sold or programmatic, and then AdSense is coming soon from the documentation. If you're trying to put ads on your stories, Glenn talked about some of the 7-page items there. There's a great tutorial over at web.dev. It'll be in the show notes there, where you can see everything that you need to do in order to advertise on those AMP stories and get going in that route. And then the one thing of note is you should look at these as different, as like a story ad, right? Where you're entering the visual environment, and it should really kind of mimic that, not just some kind of very simple, text-based ad. This is much different.
And it's also to understand that it shows up like another page. So it's like an interstitial, which I'm not a fan of. I don't know if anyone is, but anyway, It will show up as someone progresses through your story. Suddenly they're going to see an ad and have to progress through it just like they would through another page.
So now that we know everything that goes into these, I want to talk a bit about who should be using them. So I'll ask this to each of you, but we can start with Greg. Is there a specific industry or niche that you think could really benefit from web stories?
Well, I guess a caveat to me, I hate stories across the board. I don't like them. I don't understand why people are taking the time to make content. And I'm talking about just social stories in general, to make content that disappears. And that's why I actually like web stories, is because it doesn't disappear. It's like the anti-story story. It's just so different. And so, I think if you've got something that can last, that's evergreen. I know that in some of those videos we keep talking about Paul, he's saying lifestyle, food, recipes, travel, sports. If you've got something that's evergreen and can last, and is like visual first, like the example of New York City tourist attractions, right? Like that's great. You're probably an attraction. If you could put something out there and do a great job showing all the different spots, include yourself, like that's fantastic. You can kind of mix all these different worlds together. So again, that's what I would do, is say you are trying to get more, especially like Glenn said, publisher wise, go that route, anything visual. And then you see a lot of kind of what you call those like listicle things, right? Where you've got the top 7, the top whatever. And then, we talked a little bit about some comparisons. So I think if it's visual, it's worth a shot for you to test out.
Sam, who do you think should be using these?
Everybody, of course. But from my perspective, I have one issue, is that, it's limited yet in Europe, and I think in the rest of the world, we don't, web story don't show up in the mobile search. So this is a bit of pity, because who are your customer and where are they? I mean, if now I'm a company and somebody like Glenn or myself come to them and say, look, you have to invest in web story. Yes, okay, nice. But if my customers are in Europe and they cannot see what I'm producing, so it's a bit of pity, So this is something I think, I don't know if you guys have some news about what Google plans to do and when they will roll them out globally. Yes, but because
I wish.
I'm really a big fan. As Greg said, I also don't really use social network stories, because yes, why I should waste my time for only 24 hours. Here I could create something that is evergreen. And so this is, for me, I mean, based on your questions, any brand could leverage that. But in Europe, we still have this visibility issue.
Yeah, we've got to get the worldwide rollout on web stories. What do you think, Glenn?
Yeah, I mean, Sam, that's an amazing point. It's something we should probably ask Paul about, right? Hopefully we can find some more information. I think every publisher every site should be thinking about how they can utilize stories. Again, ignore them at your own peril at this point. Long term, we have no idea what can happen. Google's always, if something's not being adopted the way that they want, it could fall by the wayside. But right now, there's a lot of eyeballs and a lot of clicks that you can get. But I think, if you had how-tos, a how-to is a great way to go. Comparison, like we saw before earlier with the Surface laptop. I think sports leagues are doing a great job with that, like I explained. I think companion web stories to articles is a great way to go. I've done that. It's been successful for me. I've seen other sites do it. I think that's a great way to go. Recipes, that makes complete sense as you're going through, the steps of a recipe. So I would, by the way, covering events, we haven't even spoken about that, but you could do live updates in web stories.
Because there are no events right now, but it'll be great when we have them.
That's a good point. That's a very good point. So live events would be cool. So if anyone's having a conference and you're doing that, or I actually don't want to release because I'm going to be doing one at some point.
Cool.
But stuff like that. So anything that's out there that's going on, you could actually track. So I would, or implement a web story about. So I would think about that and test it out. You never know. Like I saw it going on, I tested it. I had 500,000 impressions with that web story. I mean, so I think publishers should really look at it.
Cool. And it's pretty clear that everyone here is team web story and thinks these are a good idea. But I wanted to ask you all about evidence you've seen that Google is really investing in this format for anyone that's not convinced yet. So Greg, do you have any evidence that you haven't shared already?
Most of the time I'm wrong. So that's the caveat. So go in the opposite direction, because I actually thought that Google needed Google Plus back in the day, and that it made total sense for a signal standpoint, and couldn't be more wrong from that. I also thought authorship made sense, where you could kind of transport some of your authority, but again, that kind of went by the wayside. So I'm wrong a lot. But I think that this is here to stay, and I think it's really due to the fact of how important this is for Discover and how much Google really needs Discover. If you look at them, in general, like you typically would think of Google as search, and just the way that Discover is baked into these Pixel phones and you can't get away from it, and how great it is, and people that use it are hooked on it. I think it's here to stay. Is it going to look the same, a few years down the road? No. Probably not, but I think that, these stories are here to stay. And then you also kind of selfishly think about it, like, what does Google care most about? Keeping people on Google, probably. And that's just me being mean. But like, if people don't link out or don't click off, again, that's a way to, people are going to be right back there on Discover if they don't do that. So I think that it makes a lot of sense for Google to go this route. And so, I think that they are investing in it. And then lastly, if you look at what they're doing with web creators over on YouTube, it is a phenomenal channel, and they're investing so much time. I just hope this isn't some like OKR for 2020 and they're going to be on the way in 2021. But right now, those videos they do are phenomenal. They're putting so much time and burning so many calories trying to help people use this. I'd say that there is a lot of evidence that this would be here to stay.
Glenn, do you have any additional evidence to share?
Well, just seeing the communication program through Google Web Creators, that is a big undertaking that they're doing, and they're pumping out a lot of content. The time and investing on the Google Docs, explaining everything, really pushing it. But I will say, and I said this in my post about web stories, it's a process. It is not simple. I know the visual editors help out, but between the storyboarding, the image creation, the video shooting, the video editing, the content writing, all that stuff, it's a process. Now, blog posts take a long time too. I know Sam has written extensive blog posts. I write, 3,000 to 4,000 word blog posts about Google updates and stuff. That takes a lot of time, but web stories take a lot of time. So I think that's a huge barrier. But moving forward, they can really do a lot of cool stuff. I've been really focused on tracking the augmented reality piece for Google, where up till now, it's mostly been like putting animals and stuff like that into the search results, but they have put more commerce related things like e-commerce related products in there that you can move around, put in your place, see how it looks, so on and so forth. Imagine they incorporated augmented reality with web stories, right? So if you had a web story of your new product line that's coming out and people could actually move the products around, click out and go buy it, add it to their cart and stuff like that. I think that's a huge opportunity. I also think more with Google News. I haven't really seen web stories showing Google News too much. Maybe I'm wrong here, but I haven't even seen them punch that. But that's also a big opportunity. So I think that they can leverage different areas. The other thing is, with YouTube Shorts, basically they're TikTok style videos, which I have kids that are in that age group. They love that and hate long form. And long form to them, by the way, is like 10 minutes, right? So imagine they can incorporate YouTube Shorts or short videos and stuff like that into web stories. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity, but like Greg said, they may be testing out a lot of things and see where it goes.
Sam, and I'm assuming you agree that Google is investing in this. Have you seen any additional evidence?
No, but I saw a bit the evolution of the story format, and like 1 year ago, it was, it was just like, let's say, a bunch of nerds. So now, 1 year later, we are here speaking in front of a large audience, and also they invested in this in the WordPress plugin. I think they rolled out. In fact, I think I was not correct when I said it's only in the US. I think now they open to Brazil and India maybe as well, the mobile version. For me, the big sign again will be when they will roll out globally web stories. Then this will be really a huge sign. And but yeah, we have hope. Let's say.
And even Shep, on that podcast you're talking about, where Pascal came on the Search Off the Record show, he was, I forget the title that he had said he was, because he's really a developer programs engineer, but he said he was like part of the like CMS integration. So they're really working, and they're like, this is why we chose WordPress. So like, there's a lot of thought, I thought, that really went into that position and what he's been doing.
Mm-hmm. And Sam, we did touch on this a little bit, but I wanted to ask you if you thought that web stories were a good idea for brands specifically to invest in, besides the limitations that they're not on the global scale yet. Do you think they're good for brands?
Of course, yes. I mean, as we said, I mean, especially for as L'Oreal did or other brands like this, I mean, leveraging stories, you can really engage with your customer in a new way. I mean, in a more immersive way, having these stories on your mobile. So I think, yes, brands should try out, but always the same. Where is your customer? So if they consume mobile search, so then yes, maybe it might be an issue here.
Mm-hmm. Glenn, how do you see the future of the web story format?
Yeah, I was touching on that before. I think, with e-commerce, augmented reality, short videos, TikTok style, maybe videos. I mean, there's a lot of different paths that they can go. The one thing I think that's important is, Google has all these surfaces, right? So there is a possibility in the future that with one algorithm update, maybe stories aren't as important in the search results, but are still super important in Discover, right? Or vice versa. I think it's perfect for Discover. For the search results, they're going to figure out pretty quickly if people think that this is high quality and relevant information during their testing, when they're testing algorithm updates and seeing people go through and understanding engagement. So I think we'll see some volatility there. But the sky's the limit with how you can use a web story. It's just a matter of, and Google obviously wants to make money also. So that's where I think the e-commerce piece potentially with augmented reality could be a really interesting fit.
Yeah, just about e-commerce. I was in touch recently with a new web story builder, a web story tool, and they are focusing on Shopify. So they will try to create stories out of your product in your e-commerce. And hopefully there will be soon a new article on my blog. So Stay tuned.
That'll be neat. And I did want to ask you all one last question. If somebody wanted to start with web stories tomorrow, our listeners, what advice do you have for them? I'll start with you, Sam.
Yeah, first you have to read my blog because it's the most comprehensive guide on this planet. So you have to read that. And but seriously, so yes, of course, starting read about what is a web story. You have to understand the format. Then I would say it depends on who you are, but me, I always like to have my hands dirty first. So you can try to develop one web story by yourself. It will take maybe 20 hours. It's not really complicated to code a web story. But let's say you spent one weekend, you know how the things are working. Then you can move to a web story builder to create more stories. But you have to understand really the core principle of web stories and all different mechanisms. So this will be my advice.
Awesome. What do you think, Greg?
Yeah, so I mean, I would definitely start by educating yourself. I think that both Glenn and Sam's blogs are the place to start. We also cover it weekly. Anytime there's any rumblings, we bring it to the forefront. We're trying to spread the news here. But I think it is definitely worth a test, regardless of who you are. It is worth a test, even just for you to grow and know it. I'd say that. But I really liked what Glenn said earlier, where it's like you need to start with the end in mind when making your web stories. How do you get people off of your web story? How do you get them to understand or do what you're looking to do? What is your conversion with this web story? The traffic's great. Maybe it's ad revenue. You just need to figure out what your goal is to do and then build those stories. Give it a shot. You really don't have that much to lose here. And again, I think that everybody should do it and just follow along Glenn, Sam, us. And then we're planning on doing some more with Discover as well, too, if you are looking to do a little bit more of that. So subscribe on your local podcast player.
Awesome. Glenn, do you have any parting words for any first-time web story creators?
Yeah, absolutely. So they actually have a simple AMP tutorial up in the docs, right? So in the Google Docs in the Developer Center. So you could actually go in there and follow along. They provide the actual code as well. You could end up in really just a few hours or less having what they built as their first. So you can at least see how it works. And then like what Sam said, I'm the same way. Definitely try and build one on your own, just even if it's really rough, no one has to see it, but understanding the tags involved, how the subset of HTML works there, validating it in the AMP tool, the web story test. You could test it in a local browser. You don't even need to put it online. You could see how it's flowing and working. And then if you have a website, which most people do, you could upload it to a directory that no one's going to see and see how it actually works up there as well. So I would start with their tutorial, see how the code works, maybe use that code as a template, and then go ahead and build your own and see how it works. And then if you wanted to, you can move to a visual editor. Or you may decide that, hey, you've coded one and you're going to reproduce those components, and maybe that's what you keep doing.
Fantastic. I think you guys have hopefully inspired some of our listeners to set these up. So I can't believe our time is already up, but I want to thank you guys again, Glenn, Sam, and Greg, for joining me. You can catch Greg on Marketing O'Clock every Friday, rain or shine. Greg, where can people contact you if they want to talk more about web stories?
Easiest place is at Greg Finn or at Marketing O'Clock on Twitter, and you either get Shep or I there, and then you can even call in. If you've got questions, call in the show, call.marketingoclock.com, ask a question, and we'll answer it for you on the show.
And Glenn has a lot of great web story content on the G Squared interactive website, which we will link to in the show notes. It's gsqi.com. Glenn, where can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a heavy Twitter user, so at Glenn Gabe, Glenn with 2 N's. You can do that, or just go to my blog and you can contact me there as well, or on LinkedIn. I'm pretty heavy on my Facebook page, LinkedIn, and then Twitter.
And if you're looking for more information about web story creation tools, Sam has awesome in-depth guides that we've talked about on samuelschmitt.com, which we will link to in the show notes. You can also access his tool through on app.samuelschmitt.com. We just featured this as our cool tool on the show last week if you want more information about it, but it's a SERP scraper tool that helps with content analysis and copywriting. It's awesome. Sam, how can our listeners get in touch with you if they want to talk web stories?
Yeah, well, I'm quite active on LinkedIn, so just connect with me. Also on Twitter, or yes, you can just contact me via my website and blog.
Awesome. It is now officially not Marketing O'Clock. Thank you guys so much. If you're looking for digital marketing news and a lot of really bad puns, please be sure to subscribe to our show. We release new episodes with Jess Budd and Mark Saltarelli every Friday, in addition to these special roundtable episodes that we are releasing every month. So thanks again, and we will see you next week.